Hi, Scott. Nice to meet you.
Hey, how you doing?
Good, good. How's it going over there?
Well, Cape Town's starting to turn into winter, and so I now need my umbrella whenever I walk, and that's a great sadness to me because I really like the sun.
Yeah, I can imagine. Like, it's so funny. I have to remember, like, your weather system is kind of different from, the rest of Africa. Yeah, you guys
Yeah,
are.
yeah, yeah. I used to live in Joburg. That's where I'm from, and so we'd have the rain, and it would come in the thunderstorms. It'd be done in an hour, and here the rain just lasts for 4 months.
Because 4 months. You're right by the water, so yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just going to start off by, making introductions. I'm Tobari. I'm a founder of Digital Economy Forum, a young think tank focused on developing and promoting tech policies, connecting policymakers with, players in the tech sector. We are hosting this event as part of the United Nations Global Digital Compact consultation process. We hope that the results or inputs of the discussions we have here today will aid the UN consultation process. We have, people that are attending that, of course, have no idea on how to regulate AI or how AI regulation should go about, how AI regulation should be done rather. Here in Nigeria, we're in the process of formulating an AI policy or framework to, if you may. And yeah, I think that's about it. While we wait for other panelists to join, I don't know if you could share your experience in the field, in developing, researching, AI policy.
Yeah, certainly. Well, thank you for those contextually remarks, just so that I have a good idea of what you guys are looking for. Myself, I'm a recovering academic. I used to work as an academic at the University of the West Indies in the Caribbean. So I'm very much used to thinking about the outsized impact of AI on sort of communities that tend to be a lot smaller, tend to have a lot less influence, tend to have a lot less clout. And so that sort of brought me to Research ICT Africa, where I'm a senior research associate and I lead the cybersecurity and information disorders projects. One of the things about sort of AI is a sort of interthread through everywhere. And so I have a bit of expertise on AI ethics, questions about algorithmic capitalism, the nature of institutions and markets on the African continent. I've done a little bit of work on fintech before. And so these are all now skills that I'm applying on a day-to-day basis with the organization. It also helps that I have a lot of wonderful colleagues that are able to sort of help on a day-to-day basis. So
yeah. I know we're meant to be joined by Mrs. Rachel, but she canceled, and fortunately, we have all ladies and gentlemen. What areas do you look into when considering regulating AI? What is it? The ethics? Is it inclusivity from the global south? Because from my perspective, I find that there isn't as much engagement, from the global south. What perspective are you, or what lens are you looking at from regulating AI?
I mean, that's a very broad question, and so I'll try to sort of maybe simplify it, step by step. One of the things that sort of very much guides my thinking around technology in Africa is the concept of neocolonialism and the framework of neocolonialism. I think that there's a lot of value to recognize the brute reality is that Africans, while not absolutely powerless, don't have the same amount of power as countries in Europe, countries in North America, China, so on and so forth. So I think sort of recognizing that, we're at the same time, I think there's a lot of utility in recognizing that there is something to the African century. I know there's a lot of rhetoric around Africa rising, and some of that stuff is maybe a bit overstated. But as sort of you in Nigeria know, you have this demographic boom that will be a consumer base that's going to drive consumption and production for the next centuries. The African tastes are going to be the primary driver of everyday commodities during the course of the century. So again, while not absolutely powerless, I think Africans are well positioned to become more aggressive bargainers around technology transfer, access to markets, so on and so forth. And so I think these broader sort of like geopolitical realities around demographics, around power, about the history of neocolonial activity over the last 40 years, 50 years, are some of the considerations that shape how I think AI is manifest on the continent. There certainly is the case that sort of we don't have as many big technology firms, but that's not to say that because we don't have them right now, in 30 years' time, we won't have them. So one of the things I'm very interested in is the potentials, the liberatory potential that these types of technologies can bring for African people more broadly. I'll sort of maybe keep it there and allow other people to jump in.
Yeah. Hi, Jackie. Hi, Samantha. I'm sorry I and Scott hit it off, right before you joined. I don't know if you would like to share what your experience has been in developing policy around the regulation of AI at your institution, and maybe what your focus has been. Maybe, hi, Jackie. Maybe Jackie first.
Okay, fine. So thank you so much, Tobore. It's a pleasure being in this session and just discussing the work we're doing around AI. So when it comes to my experience around regulating AI in the African space, I can say I see a lot of reluctance and lack of push from governments in terms of coming up with policy on actually just regulating AI and trying to implement the global AI policies. As we speak right now, I think we only have 3 countries that have strategies around AI policy. Some countries like Kenya actually took the first step, I can say back in 2019, in setting up a task force to just investigate AI and come up with a policy. But then 4 years down the line, we can see that nothing has been done towards that front. So currently we don't have any strategy and we don't have any policy. So, and this is not just in Africa or the East African region only, it cuts across all African countries. But then just trying to find out what causes the reluctance or even just the lack of push to come up with regulation in terms of AI is the problem. Like we don't understand why we're lacking regulation in this space, because countries are actively taking up AI. We see AI being implemented in so many sectors, and even the governments themselves are trying to come up with ways on how they can harness AI for service delivery. But then AI also comes with its harms. The realities that we have here in Africa are very different from the realities faced by countries in the global north. So we need to tailor AI to suit our needs and to even prevent the harms that we're currently seeing are being caused on certain communities and even certain marginalized groups. So I think the most important thing right now is just trying to come up with, just trying to push policy in this space, given how AI is, how relevant AI is in terms of boosting the economy, and just trying to deal with the harms that it causes to communities. So yeah, that's my experience in terms of formulation of policies and regulation on AI.
Hi, Samantha.
Can you hear me nicely?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm coming from more of a legal background. So my focus has mostly been on regulatory and policy perspectives of AI. And my experience has mostly been that the fusion of AI has mostly been focused on more profit making. We want to make the money, we want to make the profit, but we don't want to understand the implications of introducing these new technologies. And that's mostly the case for most of these African Union member states. So what my colleagues have said is the general consensus around Africa and adoption of policies and regulations. And just to add that lack of understanding that while these technologies are able to bring money and economic prosperity, there are implications, and those implications need to be mitigated is something that needs to be raised and awareness be spread throughout African policymakers.
So I think that I'm hearing the same thing, from the three of you, and I think it seems like AI regulation is a bit premature in Africa. Is that something you all think of, consider? Is it too premature to be considering regulation of AI?
Maybe if I can jump in and tackle that question first, and then others can jump in. I don't necessarily think it's premature. I think it's that these are developments that are going to come, and so it's important that Africans have a heads up, look on the horizon, and to try and be very thoughtful about the impacts of these kinds of constellation of technologies. It's not just AI, but there's also a whole range of ancillary types of products and markets that are going to come. And if there isn't sufficient regulation put into place, that's just going to leave Africans even more susceptible to exploitation and extractivism and all of these other types of harmful oppressions that come when there isn't adequate public interest regulation. One of the things that I think greatly is on my mind quite a bit is the types of social inequalities created by big tech and the global and as it sort of meets the global inequalities between the North and the South. That sort of leaves people like us at a great disadvantage when it comes to trying to shape these technologies. In many cases, the things that I'm worried about, it partly comes from history. Africans have long been subject to experimentation at the whims of companies and corporations. And so if we don't have this type of regulatory apparatus put into place, there's a chance that those horrific experiences will be repeated once again. And that's not to say that there will be a self-inflicted wound, obviously not, but there are things that we can do right now to be very preventative to try and ensure that less harms are caused by companies that, let's be honest over here, are trying to maximize profit. And so their interests aren't necessarily those of Africans' interests. So the types of inequalities that exist between producers and consumers, between the North and the South, and other types of inequalities that come along with that, between shareholders and workers, those are things that I think need to be at the forethought of African policymakers' minds. I'm going to hand over in case anyone else wants to add or elaborate or disagree.
Anyone? So anyway, what I hear from you is like what you said, a neocolonialism approach. I think that is very, very clear. And I think a lot of us aren't considering that while crafting tech policies. We are, again, are we too open? Are we too open in terms of digital trade in Africa? Is that what you're saying?
I mean, maybe I'll jump in and then I'll tap Jackie to take over and address. I don't actually. I think that there's value to being open. But I do think that we need to negotiate better and bargain better, particularly given, for example, the demographic boom that I mentioned earlier. If sort of big tech companies are driven by collecting data on users, well, Africans are going to be the biggest users of data this century. And so that's a lot of bargaining power. That's a lot of market power. And so I think we need to be leveraging those types of things. I think that should be unapologetic.
Jackie?
Yeah, so I'd like to jump in to the first point that you raised on whether it's too early to start regulating AI in Africa. From my own point of view, I don't think it's too early to start regulating AI in Africa, because when you just scan the countries in Africa, you see that there's active uptake of AI. Like governments are now actively using it for smart cities and even just surveilling citizens in the country. And then there's a lot of research being done by researchers on certain communities on just how AI can be tailored to suit their needs and even to just ensure their inclusion and to prevent the inequities that is being caused by AI. Now, what this brings to fore is the issue of data. Like AI really depends on a lot of data for its functionality. Like without data, there's no AI. And when you have inadequate data, you can actually come up with a very useless AI system. Now, with the data harvesting activities that are currently taking place, we see that the colonial activities that are being done in the past are now being replicated currently. And now the ownership of this data rests in these companies that are actually harvesting it. And the communities from which this data is being harvested from, they do not get any benefit from that data. In fact, they do not even get access to their data. So I think it's very crucial to now start regulating AI from this front, because data and AI tie closely. So I think data is a point that should be looked at keenly when regulating AI. And also another thing is we can also look at is the benefits that these communities get from their data, and even the economic benefits and the power. Now, who gets power from this data? It's the companies that pick them. But the communities from which this data is harvested lack power towards their own data. They cannot even use it for their own social needs. So these are things that I think are very critical at this point. And towards this end, I think the things that come up to my mind right now are issues to do with data justice, economic justice, and even just indigenous data sovereignty. These are crucial aspects that should be looked at right now when regulating AI.
Interesting. Samantha?
So as Africa, we're actually in a good
You're muted.
I think I am muted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I was saying as Africa, we're actually in a good position to understand and do more research using case studies that we've already seen from, say, America with regards to facial recognition, how it has been discriminating against the Black, which are the vulnerable in American society. And if we take that and say majority of Africans are Black people, and the facial recognition systems that we're using, so regulation wouldn't be premature. We actually have a good opportunity to ensure that regulation actually benefits the people, because we can see the case study, we can see what's happening in society and use that real-time evidence to inform policy and regulatory standards.
Okay. I think before we go on, my co-host Tracy is here. Tracy, oh, she's gone. She was here a second ago. Oh, hi, Tracy. I think she...
Hello, Tobore. Hello, Scott, Jackie, Samantha. You guys are blowing my mind. Amazing, amazing.
Yeah, I think she... Hi, Tracy. Anyway, so one, do you want to say anything, Tracy?
No. I'm just listening. If and when I do, I'd like them to exhaust, then I can come in.
Okay. I wanted to, you mentioned data, a lot, and I think this is very interesting because tomorrow we're discussing cross-border data flows. I don't want to go into that right now, but it seems at the heart of regulating AI is actually regulating, data and cross-border data flow. Is that a yes? Scott?
I mean, I absolutely think so. Yes. I mean, you, as sort of Jackie and Samantha well articulated, data is the fuel of AI systems. So if there isn't adequate regulation, these things need to be conjoined. They cannot simply be seen as discrete, separate regulatory projects. They have to be seen as one, the sheer totality of regulation. They cannot simply be segmented out this way or that.
Samantha?
And we do have data centers, and we do have, we can develop the infrastructure in Africa to have our own ownership of these data. So I think, following up on what Scott is saying, we need to make sure that it's with us, and we need to make sure that we trust our own organizations, our own local companies as Africans to be able to deliver that and have more investment in infrastructural development that will also enable full utilization of AI technologies.
What do you think, Jackie? Do you think yes or no?
I totally agree. Cross-border data flows is a very crucial issue, and I really like the recommendations that have been laid out in the AU policy framework. So I was doing research last year on availability of data in Kenya for development of AI systems, and what I came across really blew my mind, because we lack the statistical capacity in African countries. When you look at generally just African countries, there's lack of public data that can actually be used for developing AI systems. And in countries, for example, like Kenya, which have now come up with open data initiatives, there's actually no data in these systems. Like Kenya set up an open data initiative, I think back in 2019, 2018, and since then nothing has been uploaded in the systems. And it's not like we don't have data in African countries. We actually have data. Data is being collected across every sector. Like every sector has very relevant data that can be used for AI systems. But then this data has not been put in an electronic format that can actually be harnessed by AI systems, or even in a format that can be used in a region. Or in some other sectors, you can find that, okay, fine, there's data, but data is not clean. The data that we have there is not accurate. It cannot even be harnessed for any purpose. So I think when talking about cross data flows in Africa, one thing that we really need to look at is the current data desert that we have in the country. Like, how can this data desert be addressed? Like, what initiatives can governments come up with? What can governments actually do to ensure that there's actually public data that can be used towards this front?
Okay. Wow, I think this discussion is just shifting away from what I thought the focus would be, which is very interesting. I thought we'll be discussing the ethics of data, and now we're discussing closing the data divide, addressing the current data deserts, setting up data centers, because if we want to regulate AI, we should start with owning our data. And I think that isn't something that is said well enough. Most people are just focused on the ethics of AI, mostly, I think, out of fear. So this is very, very, interesting, a very, very interesting take. What would you, okay, so we're meant to have take a survey. And this survey is meant for, other viewers that are watching right now. Please just click yes or no. There are 10 questions in the first section, and I believe 8 questions in the second section. So those are for other participants, not for the host or the panelists. So back to what I was saying, I find this, to be quite new. what would you suggest to policymakers if you were to speak with, let's say, the head of artificial intelligence regulations in Nigeria? What will you tell him to focus on? Data? Because again, that's like a whole new thinking, you know, from our perspective. And I just like to hear, you know.
So for myself, the first thing I would do is I'd ask for a pay raise, because I'd be talking to a person well outside of my regular haunt.
Okay.
But on a serious note, one of the things that I would try to sort of convey is that the governance of data, as you say, is a very an evolving and evolving area, and I think this is an opportunity. On the one hand, we sort of see the nature of global governance changing itself. We sort of see the rise of new trade blocs. We sort of and these things are almost week by week developments. You know, we see Russia and China now trying to become form a deeper type of alliance. We sort of see the Americans trying to now decouple from the global system. I mean, 40, 50 years ago, Africans were talking about decoupling, and now the Americans are talking about decoupling, or at least a selective strategic decoupling. And so we see institutions waning. For example, if we project out current trajectories, the World Trade Organization is not going to have a lot of influence in the next couple of years. On the other hand, we see other places that may have much more influence, like the Secretariat for the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, as it tries to push towards the digital single market, or the single digital market. And so the entire nature of global governance is changing. And so we need to think about where we apply our efforts and whether those efforts will be enduring. So it doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense to go invest a lot of time petitioning and bidding at the World Trade Organization if it's not going to have any influence in 5, 6, 7 years' time, right? So I think we need to be much more strategic with where we're doing our negotiations, so that the institutions and venues have yield fruits for the long term. At the same time, that doesn't necessarily mean that states are disappearing. The states clearly still have a lot of influence in the rule of law and establishing regulations, and they should be the prime site at which regulatory efforts occur. One of the things that I'm a little bit cautious of, because there's a large push, whether it be through UNESCO, or whether it be through the UN, or whether it be through the AU, there's a lot of push to have these global initiatives to set standards around data and the like. And those things, for the most part, are good. The downside, though, is that there's now more distance from citizens. And so, as we've seen in other places where people feel a bit more abstracted away from the political process, they feel like they're being influenced rather than being able to influence. And so if we set all our standards around data at the supranational level, then there's a distance between the people who are going to feel those regulations and whether they feel as if they have democratic control to help shape those regulations. And so this is why I think there's a lot of value in still making a state the site of regulatory efforts, and not just simply leaving it up to the UN or the AU or some other type of entity, even though those entities have a lot of use. I'm going to sort of pause there and allow other people to jump in.
I'll come back to you. I have some questions. Samantha, Jackie, actually. What would you, so in Nigeria, we have two different institutions regulating data and another regulating AI. Would that mean collaboration? Because I haven't heard from any government institution in Nigeria that they are looking at regulating data as a form of regulating AI. What would you suggest? Jackie.
Thank you so much for that. It's very, very important to look at data when it comes to regulating AI, because what you're trying to push for here at the end of the day is not only equality and inclusion of marginalized groups, but ensuring that the country at the end of the day retains data sovereignty. That is, in as much as this data is being harvested for the development of AI systems that we can use for our country, we should ensure that we still retain control and power of our own data. That is, we can still use it for our own benefit as a country. We can still use it to come up with policies that regulate spaces in our own country. So what should be keenly looked at when regulating data is data sovereignty and also indigenous data sovereignty. In as much as data is being harvested from these communities should still be able to control, that is, their own data, control who can access this data, who owns this data, how is this data being used on our behalf. So basically what should be looked at here is the state control and community control. In as much as we're trying to push for equity, we should still ensure that we still retain control over our own data. That is data that concerns us, and data that concerns us and concerns our communities, our culture, and even traditional practices generally.
Back to you, Scott. So between what Jackie just said and you previously said, I'm seeing a common thread of one, data sovereignty, and there was something else you said regarding the nature of global governance, which seemed to me like protectionism. So how, in terms of digital trade, back to that, how should we manage regulating AI within a free market philosophy? How can one go about that without looking too stringent?
I mean, so let me sort of maybe work backwards with your question. So the first thing is to recognize that sort of all markets require state regulation. States make markets. That's sort of what the sociology of markets have, the academic studies have shown for a century now. And so one of the things about sort of a lot of free markets ideology is it sometimes pushes it a bit too far to recognize that there isn't really a role for the state. Regardless of whether you're pro-market or you have ambivalent stances on the market or you're anti-market, the state is still nevertheless the central role player in creating conditions for supply and demand more broadly. And in this case, sort of Africans have, for the most part, not all Africans, there are some unfortunate circumstances where there are authoritarian governments, but there are liberal representative democracies that help to channel the will of the people on how the state is to control the market. I think that those things really need to be let in. That's not to say that there shouldn't be commerce, but I do think that the states and the people should be able to exercise their influence to a greater degree. For example, if as Jackie was talking about, the desire for community sovereignty or community ownership over data, you can't really. That tends to be a bit of a conflict between unrelenting free market and communities and the like. So what I'm trying to suggest over here is we need to think about the types of negotiated settlements, if you will, between the market, the state, the people, so on and so forth. These aren't things that can easily be reduced to sound bites, and these things often are about interests and power and clout and all of these other types of things. But I do think that we need to have very open conversations about what kinds of ways of life do Africans want to have. How can commerce help that, and in what ways can commerce suppress that? And so this sort of leads me to questions about somewhat of experimentation. I think as I said earlier, there's one thing when people in the global north or China are experimenting on Africans. I think there's a difference when Africans are trying to experiment with types of firms, for example. I think there's a lot of value, as Jackie was talking about community sovereignty over data. There are a number of other types of ideas that are also circulating at the moment. For example, that there are user unions, which means that a group of users will come together and say that they are going to have a collective bargaining over the uses of their data. Now that sort of strikes us as maybe a bit odd because we think of unions just simply confined to labor. But if we also think that data is a byproduct of labor, and some cases is labor in the case of content creation, maybe these things start to make a little bit more sense, or that there's value to entertaining these things. my larger point is that we should be open to try to sort of experiment to see what things work for our conditions and our situations and the like.
Beautiful. I think, the main takeaway from that is experiment, right? Samantha, what do you were speaking about, data centers earlier on. Have you considered, the infrastructure gap we have in Africa in terms of even trying to retain our data? Because I think that's one of the biggest issues. If we do not have the infrastructure, then how can we basically make these sort of regulations to retain the data? I know you brought that up earlier.
Okay, I think bringing more awareness to policymakers on how this can actually help Africa, because most times with regards to things like infrastructure development, you want to see how it's going to help. And with the lack of knowledge regarding what data is and how it is actually a key resource for using artificial intelligence, it can be difficult to then say, no, let's just have a data center. So I think we have to start before we actually regulate, raise more awareness and understanding, maybe educational programs that encourage the understanding of data as a key resource and why we need that infrastructural development. But coming back to questions of power as well, perhaps trying to regulate from that perspective that we need indigenization of data and policy regulations that speak towards indigenization.
Okay, yeah, so indigenization, like policy and community engagements, like, okay, yeah, I think that makes sense. I think this is the first time I'm actually hearing about, community engagement over, data ownership. I know for certain we do not have any we don't have such framework here in Nigeria. I think that's a fresh thought and a very fresh idea. And I think it's something that we need to experiment with. My biggest, I think the biggest concern I have with regulating AI from a data, from a data perspective is definitely one, the infrastructure. Do we have the infrastructure to negotiate? Scott spoke about negotiating. I know in South Africa, you guys have a lot of data centers. In Nigeria, we are way behind. And if we do not have, such data centers, then we simply don't even have that bargaining power to start to demand data sovereignty. What should we do? Should we then focus on building the infrastructure, or should we just scrap the idea of even bargaining at that level? Maybe I'll start with Scott.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we have to recognize that in some cases, it isn't quite profitable to build some of the networks in Africa for a variety of reasons, right? So I think that there's a role for the state to start to build and subsidize the development of networks. We'll use telecommunications for an example. There's good, Safaricom in Kenya is a good example of how public-private partnerships have built out networks that have ended up then being sort of profitable and generated revenues for the state. Now, there are sort of problems that sort of come with that, of course. We could talk about that if you wish, but this is an example of how the state can be an active player in the market to try and overcome existing types of market failures. I think sort of once that those market failures are overcome, you can then start to create the financial incentives to build the types of industries that will create data centers, so on and so forth. That the small and medium enterprises that will use data and create innovative products, for handsets, so on and so forth. The types of things we see going on around the world. So that kind of infrastructure investment, I think, has to sort of be state-led, because the state is able to get large loans, sometimes at favorable rates from the Chinese, to be able to build this type of infrastructure. I don't think that that's necessarily going to jeopardize any type of market activity. I think in many cases it'll be an enabler of market activity down the line. So I think that that's something that they should be lent into. The other thing, and this is maybe the final point, is that one can't really have good markets when there's a lot of conflict around, because that just increases the costs of doing business. So absolutely, we need to bring peace and stability across the African continent. Otherwise, otherwise there's very little. The cost of doing business just increases so much, so that people aren't going to be able to benefit from the types of goods that the digital society has to offer.
Jackie, what do you think? Do you think focusing on addressing market failures should be a starting point? Addressing market failures regarding our infrastructure should be a start point for regulating AI in Nigeria, because that's an issue. We don't even have the infrastructure.
Okay, I think starting from the regulation point should be the starting point. That is ensuring, number one, do we have data localization provisions in place? Because regulations actually forms the foundation of now this infrastructure and just generally just infrastructure. So I think coming up with provisions around data localization, do we have provisions that regulate data localizations? Do we have provisions that ensure that data collected from this country is still subject to the laws of this country? So if we have that in place, I think we can now move from this point to now the infrastructure level, just ensuring that we have frameworks that ensure that data is localized within a country. So I think that should be the starting point, and then you now move to the infrastructural level, because you cannot have infrastructure if you do not have regulations in place to ensure that these things are running smoothly. So that should be the starting point, ensuring that, okay, fine, before even these data localization provisions, do we have, number one, data protection laws? That should be the anchor. Now, from these data protection laws, do we have data localization provisions? Number two. Now, once we have these provisions in place, they will now direct us towards the infrastructure that we need to ensure that now data is used for our own benefit and data is just located within our country for our own use.
Thank you. I would like to remind other people that are here that there's a poll, and you could just click on the poll icon and fill the survey, yes or no, yes or no. I think 18 questions. Also, if you have questions, you could raise your hands, and we'll allow you to ask any of the panelists questions. Please participate. I think I love what you all have shared so far. Two major takeaways are definitely one, data. And then from there, we start to extrapolate other aspects like, infrastructure, trade policies. How do you think this would play out within the African Continental Free Trade Act, Jackie?
Yeah, sorry. Could you please reiterate your question? I think I missed.
So what we're talking about, like data sovereignty in terms of regulating AI, and from there, hopefully focusing on infrastructural development. How do you think this would play out in terms of trade and maybe foreign policy within the African continent? Is there a framework, for the African continent, and should there be a framework that allows for a less protectionist approach I think that's the question. Yeah.
Okay. In terms of a framework that prevents the protectionist approach, I can't say we have any at the moment. But I think now this is where cross-border data flows plays a key role, because we're trying to create an environment where just goods can flow freely within countries. And in terms of flowing goods and services within countries, also need data in order to do this. So yeah, I don't know. I think I'd push that to Scott.
That's fine. Scott.
I mean, I'll offer some quick remarks so Samantha can jump in because she's the trade lawyer.
Oh,
and so yes.
So that's who we should be thinking.
So the obvious point to raise over here is that as we start to form this, this digital this single digital market in Africa, we need to think about, the difference between the technical elements of localization and the rhetoric around localization, which is about power. If we think about the technical elements of localization, that becomes a little bit more difficult to accomplish, given the need to sort of transfer, to create networks that are global in scope, right? So there are sort of technical limitations towards localizations by their very nature. You can't have networks and transferring data across them if you are very stringent upon localization. But there's this question about power. The second thing, though, is when it comes to forming this digital single market, we need to have massive harmonization. We need to have deep and meaningful harmonization. And this very simple example is copyright law. If copyright law isn't standardized across the entire continent, the thing that I transfer to you, maybe we'll just say, pick a very silly example, 10% of my item can be copyrighted, whereas yours is 5%, and suddenly I send a product to you, it's a digital product, and now you're in violation of the law. And so you need to have harmonization over here to ensure that these networks can operate fairly seamlessly, or to the extent that sort of any marketplace can operate as seamlessly as possible. We need to be very aggressive in harmonizing, and in some cases that's not actually a question of sovereignty per se, but I think there's more recognition that there's a value in Pan-African solidarity around the same types of standards. If there's a collective decision around what kind of standards we're going to choose, that may soften the kind of blow to sovereignty that some countries are invested in. Anyway, I'm now going to hand over to Sam, who's going to blow us away with some comments.
Scott, you're raising the bar high now. I mean, if we look back on the key objective of the African Continental Free Trade, it's for socio-economic development, and data localization speaks towards that. So I think it's easier to integrate within the different projects and implementation frameworks that they have now. However, we also need to look at the political imbalances, the regional imbalances also speak towards that. So I think it would lean more towards partnerships with different countries. For instance, if Ghana has data centers that they're not fully utilizing, maybe the Continental Free Trade Area can have regulations in place that make it more effective or possible for Nigeria and Ghana to be able to fully utilize that for socio-economic development of both states, which would ultimately improve continental free trade.
I know we had a raised hand earlier, I think. Thank you, everyone. I am still struggling to figure out how I think in my head, it still sounds, it seems like it, too much protection. And I know within Africa, we could probably, develop a framework that works under our free trade agreements. But on a global scale, are we going to be left fighting ourselves? I know China is hoarding data. A lot of authoritarian governments are hoarding data. Are we slowly going down a spiral to the point where we all will be hoarding data? I think that's a fair question to ask, don't you think?
I mean, I'll take that one first. I think that there is real concerns about the extent of protectionism. Like one of the difficult things about regulating digital networks is that many of our assumptions from the 20th century don't quite hold up. And so we also have a bit of a translation difficulty using sort of older concepts to try understand something that's both qualitatively and quantitatively different. And so when we use the language of decolonizing data, for example, what does that sort of mean at the technical level around ownership and rights? I think these are things that do need to be articulated more strongly. And we can't really do that in a venue like this because just the nature of it. It's better if we're around a table in person, we have more time, so on and so forth. So I think that we also need to recognize that some of the rhetoric that we have around sovereignty is really about people trying to express that they want to have agency over the development of AI, data, connectivity in their societies. And so we need to understand these things at the level of political expression, not necessarily technical limitations, if you will. And so I think what people are trying to do, and I could be wrong, is they're trying to articulate that they want to have greater agency in how technology develops in on their continent, in their regions, in their country, in their societies. And this is why I go back to the point about having states that represent people and a little bit more musculature, so that people, when they start to do trade globally using the products that they designed, and same thing when people start to trade here, that these things are seen as legitimate, justifiable, so on and so forth. Thank you.
If I can just add on, if that is okay.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, adding on to what Scott is saying, that is why we mostly advocate for AI that is transparent, AI that is accountable, so that people are able to understand. And if people are able to understand, then it'll be easier to implement these protection measures, and it'll be easier for them to feel like they have more power over their own data.
You've been saying something over and over, Samantha, and I think that's education. And I want to tie it back to, I think, so something Jackie said, and that is a community-based approach to agency. I think this is just me thinking. Maybe if we have better education of the power and usefulness of AI and the data people are producing, then community agency can work. And maybe if community agency works, the idea of a national political expression and the politics that happens, when countries negotiating will be less. I don't know if that makes any sense. I'm thinking if we have more community agency, then it wouldn't look like an approach of protectionism. I think so. I don't know, but what do you think, Jack?
So I don't think it will now lead towards protectionism, because if I tie to what Scott said earlier, just coming up with agreements, segments, let's say between the governments and these organizations and these communities, I think it will actually go a long way in trying to mitigate the protectionism aspect and just trying to limit the use of data. So coming up, reaching a consensus and coming up with agreements on basically how this data can be used, what communities just laying out the expectations around their data, and the other parties being obliged to this and complying with the community needs. I think it will go a long way in preventing protectionism and even just limiting the use of data for the growth of AI.
Okay. I think we have a question from Mune. Mune, do you want to ask your question? You raise your hands. Mune Al-Alawi? No? Okay. Sorry about that, guys. Okay, I think we have shared, and it's been very interesting learning from you all this perspective when thinking about this, and we need to seriously consider that. I'm really struggling to make sense of this because, again, I don't think any of us here are thinking about it from foreign policy perspective. The most interesting thing I have learned today is, the community-based approach to agency, owning data. And I think that will be the greatest experiment to research, look into, and maybe develop and advise policymakers to take up. Because I think if we have real agency and we're educating the locals that, hey, you're producing data and you should own your data. Your data tomorrow will be fed into some machines, blah, 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 blah. Then maybe we could have that real agency. What is really lacking is it really does that agency. We just have, top national governments, policymakers sitting down in a room, probably, call for inputs, but real, not real, stakeholder engagement, and they come up with policies. And I think that has led to a lot of disjointed, frameworks. I'm speaking from the Nigerian, perspective. We have, an institution, responsible for, regulating AI. We have a separate institution responsible for regulating, data, protection. I don't think, they're talking to each other. I would find out if they are. And I think that's a really, really big issue. But beyond that, are they educating the public? And I think the answer is a big one. I know that for certain, that the answer is a very big one. And then go back to the beginning of the question. The question I asked at the beginning, rather, is this, are we thinking of regulating AI a bit too early? But I think Scott has answered that question. So I'm not going to go back there. Thank you all for your participation. Thank you for joining Scott, Jackie, and Samantha. I will be in touch with you. Thank you very much for all our participants and panelists too.
Well, thank you for inviting us.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, thank you for inviting us. I'm sure we thoroughly enjoyed ourselves.
Yeah, I'm going to keep this discussion going, by the way, expect emails from me. All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Nice to meet you. Bye.